Alright, part 2 of the paper writing guidelines. Part 1 should already be available. So, outline, paper's not a grocery list of citations, hearsay is not evidence, society is not monolithic. What do we mean by these? A paper should not be what looks like a grocery list of citations. So if you're going to cite something, you need to explain what's important about it, why you're citing it, what it means. A citation in and of itself does not really mean anything or establish anything other than what it literally says. So for example, a citation with minimal explanation can establish something factual. So if you want to show that Frankenstein's monster has yellow skin, this passage, his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath, is perfectly sufficient for establishing that he has yellow skin, but it doesn't really establish much else. It's a fairly short citation, and there's not a significant amount of explanation or analysis that's being provided. You should not have just a series of citations with minimal analysis or discussion between them, right? That's not going to get you particularly deep. So if you're citing passages from Frankenstein to show the most literal or surface interpretation, that's going to look like a plot summary. It's not going to lead you to a particularly deep analysis. If you're going to cite a lengthy passage, there should be something interesting in that passage. There should be some depth that you're going to get to from looking at that passage. If you think about the best movie reviews that you've read, if you don't read movie reviews, check out Rotten Tomatoes for your favorite film. Look at the little blurbs they have excerpted from the movie reviews. Go read the entire movie review. A lot of film critics are hysterical and brilliant and funny, and they do analysis of the film. They give you a way to watch the film, to understand the film in a new way with some new context. This is what you want to be trying to do in your papers. Okay, you want to take these passages and show me a new way to read the passage. Show me some new interpretation, some interesting interpretation, some depth, something below the surface that I can get to. So this passage from chapter 23, she was there, lifeless and inanimate, thrown across the bed, her head hanging down, her pale and distorted features half covered by her hair. Everywhere I turn, I see the same figure, her bloodless arms, lashed from fly the murderer's bridal ear. Right. So this passage, by itself, as it's stated, this is not evidence that the monster is not a literal monster, but is really this metaphorical evil alter ego of Victor that has emerged to murder Elizabeth because somehow Victor's a necrophiliac because his repressed sexuality that is not allowed to be expressed in polite early 19th century European society has emerged to murder his new wife. So this passage does not mean that unless you explain to me very carefully why I should read this passage that way. Now, I'm not saying you can't read this passage that way. It's the most vivid description of Elizabeth. Probably there might be another description of her when she's very young early in the text, but this is certainly one of the most, if not the most vivid description of Elizabeth that shows up in the text of Frankenstein, and it doesn't happen until she's dead. So you could certainly ask the question, well, what's going on with Victor? Why does he seem to be more interested in describing his beloved wife after she's been murdered by this monster? You could read this passage that way, but this passage is a lengthy passage. In and of itself doesn't mean anything other than that Elizabeth is dead on the bed, unless you explain to me very carefully why I should read the passage that way, which you could do. It would be really fun, but you need to provide the analysis, right? Citing this passage just by itself just establishes that Elizabeth is dead on the bed. There's not really any analysis there unless you provide it, right? All I'm going to get is the literal surface reading. So if you find yourself using a passage from the text and you want to conclude something sophisticated, you want to use this as part of a nuanced argument, some creative argument, some clever argument, what you're going to need to do is explain to me why we should read the passage that way. If you're using a lengthy passage as part of a sophisticated analysis, you want to conclude something that's more complicated than just what's literally there, and you're not putting much analysis. You're just putting like one sentence after the passage to say, well, this establishes this complicated thing I want to say. You really need to reconsider what you're doing. You're going to need to put some extra effort into that. You're not really sort of finishing the analysis at that point. So hearsay is not evidence. This is extremely important to keep in mind, not just for academic writing, but really for any kind of rhetoric or argument. So you want to always avoid blanket generalizations like some say, or people think, or many believe, or it's been said that, or any of those sort of generic statements of belief. Because somebody reading this can always say, well, who are these people that think or say or believe these things? So if you can't point to specific people, usually through some sort of a citation of previous scholarship or survey results or just something to show that there are, in fact, some people who believe or say or think these things, then how do I know you're not just making up some straw man argument that you're just going to go and debunk or discredit? So if you're going to talk about people saying or thinking and believing things, I need to know who these people are. Now, if you do this on Wikipedia, the editors will actually go in and flag this. So this is actually from the article about Frankenstein, which is pretty well sourced. Most of basically everything on the page, and as of this is what, September, October 2014, everything actually has a lot of sources for it. But here's this one here. There was a 1606 gravediggers affair, yet another suggested inspiration for the writer. And so this person's throwing out that this gravediggers affair was suggested by somebody as an inspiration for the writer. And so we've got this citation needed here. There's sort of two things that need to be supported that aren't. We've got that somebody has suggested that this 1606 gravediggers affair was an inspiration for Mary Shelley, the writer of Frankenstein. But there's no evidence being provided that anyone's ever said this. It's just said that it's a suggested inspiration. It's not saying who's suggesting it. And then, of course, if it is a suggested inspiration, well, we'd want to know who's suggesting it, and we want to have a reference to why they're suggesting it. Is there evidence that Mary Shelley read the text? Does she mention it in her journal? Something about this gravediggers affair. Is a copy of the, some report about the gravediggers affair in her personal things that were found, after she passed away or something like that. I mean, there could be many, many ways in which we would conclude that the gravediggers affair was very possibly an influence, an inspiration for the writer, but without the citation to say who suggested this, we have no way to find this stuff out. Our scholarship basically ends here. It's a dead end. So that's bad for a number of reasons. And so whenever there's these little statements left out, so, somebody suggested or some say or many think on Wikipedia, the editors will go in, they'll put this little citation needed there. It's kind of a cool thing. So remember that society is not a monolithic entity. So you don't want to overgeneralize about what society thinks or what society says. Somebody can always come along and say, well, which society? Are you saying that everybody thinks or says this? Are you saying that people in a particular time period think or say this? Are there significant dissenting voices that don't think or say this that we should know about? These are big questions that you need to be prepared to ask and understand and discuss if you're going to generalize about what society says or what society thinks. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't many ways in which generalizing about society isn't useful and sometimes necessary depending on your argument. I'm just saying that you have to be careful when you're doing it, and you have to do it usually in particular ways. So sometimes there's widespread enough agreement that you can just generalize. So, if you want to generalize about biologists, you could say that, well, biologists believe in evolution. Now, there's going to be a couple of dissenting voices. They're wrong, but they're out there. Because you can always find somebody that will agree with any statement. There are apparently people that believe that the U.S. government are actually lizard people who disguise themselves as human. It's not a lot of people. It's not a widespread belief, but there are, in fact, some small number of people, a handful or two in the country that actually believe that. So biologists generally believe that species are the product of evolution by natural selection. You can actually generalize about that because it's such a prevalent belief in biology that you're safe to generalize there. But you're not generalizing about all of society, you're just generalizing about biologists, and you're picking something that there's actually like a published record of widespread agreement about. Now, there are many ways in doing literary analysis where you actually kind of have to generalize about society or generalize about a setting. This is because authors and directors use settings and they use society as an important component of their filmmaking or their writing. But the key thing here is when you're talking about setting and when you're talking about the prevailing attitudes of a particular society, you're not claiming that the setting is always like this or the society always thought or always believed this. You're looking at the way the director uses that society or uses that setting. So again, you're not the one generalizing, you're commenting on the way that the director generalizes or the way that the writer generalizes. This is actually quite different. It's a subtle difference. It gives you a way to write about setting and to write about society, but you're not the one saying that 1950s America was like this, or, the Midwest is like that. You're saying, well, the director is using it this way, or the writer is using the 1950s in this way. They're making these generalizations, and here's what those generalizations mean for the rest of their work. It's not you making the generalization, it's somebody else. You're commenting on their generalization. So, three sort of simple ways you can do this. There's obviously many more ways to do this. You can look at how the use of the setting advances the theme of the work. You can analyze or critique the director's depiction of a setting. And you can actually look at the author's historical context. This particularly works when you're looking at older writing. So, for example, we might want to look at how the setting advances the author or the director's work. It advances their theme. Good example here, Gattaca uses a lot of imagery that's reminiscent of the 1950s. Even though the cars are apparently these fancy electric cars, they kind of look like they're from the 50s. Everybody seems to spend a lot of time going out to jazz clubs. There's an obsession with right-handedness. You can look at these images and look at these sort of stereotypical emblems of conformity from the 1950s and talk about the ways in which this reliance on these stereotypes about the 1950s are being used to advance some theme in Gattaca, perhaps the stifling conformity that comes out of this obsession with genetics or something like that. And so what's fascinating about this is you're not the one claiming that the 1950s, everybody was conformist in the 1950s, because obviously everyone wasn't conformist in the 50s. You're just looking at the way that this kind of stereotypical understanding is being used by the director of Gattaca. So a second way you can do this is you can look at how a writer or director criticizes what they seem to think is the prevailing opinion of a particular society through art. So the extreme example of this is the movie Footloose, about this, hyper-religious Midwestern town that bans dancing for the young people. And of course, Kevin Bacon has to come along. I'm going back to the original Footloose from the 1980s. I realize there was a remake, but I just don't see how that could possibly be good. I mean, you how do you get better than Kevin Bacon, really? Kevin Bacon, I mean, there's really no need to remake Kevin Bacon's work. But anyway, so we've got this hyper-religious Midwestern town where dancing is illegal, and then we've got this, happy dancing young people and love and art and dancing triumph over all or something. I haven't seen the movie since I was very young. I actually don't really even remember what happens. I just know that you're not supposed to dance because it's a, religion and the Bible and whatnot, which doesn't necessarily seem to make a lot of sense, but that's not the point. The point is that in the film, this is just a given that, in this town, everyone seems to believe dancing is bad. And so, you could look at how the film deals with this. Now, it would be very, very hard to argue that dancing's, routinely outlawed by large segments of contemporary society, because it's not, but in this town it is. Okay, none of this worked. This is all fucking